So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here, and this is another episode of Summer Addiction. In this video, I'm going to be helping my buddy out with his 2017 Axis boat. We go wake surfing a lot during the summer, and we started having trouble with the right side Surfgate. The left side works fine every time. The right side was intermittently getting worse and worse and got to the point where it wasn't working at all. In this video, I'm going to go over how you can get into the system to go into the calibration of the Surfgate and go over the reasons you might need to calibrate the Surfgate. I'm also going to show you how to go into the service mode, and that will make it so you can operate the Surfgates when you're out of the water so you can see what's going on. I'm going to show you where you can manually override the Surfgate in case it gets stuck in the open position so you can make it back to the ramp. And I'm also going to be giving you some extra information on stuff that we've learned while using this Surfgate, either by personal experience or by doing a little research. So in our case, the left side was working fine, but the right side was getting worse and worse and eventually not working at all. So what we decided to do is swap the actuators side to side to see if the problem changed from the right side to the left side. We did do that. The problem stayed the same. Then we switched the wiring harnesses side to side, and that did switch the problem from the right side to the left side. So since none of us are goofy-footed, that's going to get us through the rest of this summer, guys. But I will probably be posting a video on some more diagnostic and what we ended up getting to the final root of the problem in a later video. So also keep in mind that we actually switched these actuators in a Fry's parking lot right before going to the lake, and I was having my daughters film this. So if it's a little shaky sometimes, you can understand why, but you still get a full understanding of what we're doing and what's going on. So because we are messing with some electrical connections, I felt I had to be very thorough in this video, so it is pretty long. So here is a chapter index of what takes place in this video and at what times they happen. So I don't waste your time. If you're looking for a specific thing, you can bypass what you don't need to see. And let's get to it. So the first thing I'm going to get into is how to calibrate your Surfgate and the reasons you might need to recalibrate your Surfgate. With the key in the on position, you're going to use the right arrow to get where it says change settings. Then press the enter button. Then you're going to use the right or left arrows to scroll up or down until you get to Surfgate calibration. Once you're on that, you're going to press enter. Then it's going to tell you to make sure your obstructions are clear. And then you're going to press enter again. At this point, if one of your gates is stuck open, it should start to close. Once it is in the stowed position or fully retracted, you need to press that enter one more time, and that will complete the calibration. In the calibration mode, it will continuously try and close those surf gates until you press that enter button. So you do want to do that as soon as they're both fully retracted, because there's no real purpose in continuously pulsing that power to those motors. So a quick example of why your Surfgate might get stuck in the open position is if you're in the middle of wake surfing and it loses power or ground. For example, shutting the key off, you're going to lose power to the Surfgate system, and that Surfgate's going to be in the open position at that time. When you return power to that Surfgate system, it does not know it's open. So you would have to go into the calibrate mode, and that will shut the surf gates, so then it knows that they are both in the retracted position and it should start working correctly again. Now obviously you wouldn't intentionally shut the key off right in the middle of wake surfing, but this could also happen from a weak connection or a loose power or ground on the battery, etc. So let's say that you've got a Surfgate stuck open and you go to calibrate it and it still will not shut because something is actually faulty in the system itself. If that's the case, you can use a wrench to loosen this nut on the actuator itself. It will take quite a few turns of loosening that nut, but it will get to the point where you can take your hand and push the Surfgate in and retract that cylinder manually. Once it is retracted, you're going to tighten that nut back down, and that'll get you back to dock. Alright, so here's a breakdown of how this actuator basically works so you can have an understanding of it. We have a DC motor here. That DC motor, when you put either power or ground, or power and ground when it switches to either retract or extend. That turns that motor, which in turn turns a little hydraulic pump. There's a built-in reservoir in here, and what that pump does is in the extend position, it puts hydraulic pressure to this side of the piston and pushes the rod out this way and lets the oil that's in this section return to the reservoir. When you go into the retract mode, that same concept happens. It's going to put hydraulic pressure to this side of the piston and push the piston in and return this side from the cylinder back to the reservoir. And that is how that extends and retracts. So what this bypass nut does is there's an extra port from this side of the cylinder to the other. When this is tightened down, it does not allow fluid to transfer. So this fluid will stop here, this fluid will stop here. When you loosen that nut, that allows the fluid from this side to go right through to the other side, and that's what allows you to manually push this Surfgate shut to get you back to dock. So now I'm going to go over what the service Surfgate does and how to get into it, which is pretty much the exact same way that you got into the calibration mode. Once you get on that wastegate service, you're going to press enter, and then you're going to have a screen that says Surfgate service off or on. When that screen pops up, you're going to be in the off position. You can use the side-to-side arrows to move it to the on position and press enter, and both Surfgates should open. Then if you go ahead and put it back to the off position using the arrows and press enter, both Surfgates should retract at that point. And that feature makes it so you can kind of figure out what's going on with your Surfgate system either in or out of the water, just like the calibration. So in order to switch these actuators, we had to remove some paneling and the flooring so we could access the wiring that was going through the stern of the boat. To remove the main engine panel on both sides, you just turn these knobs 90 degrees and pull those off. Then there was 2 screws that held the front panel and back panel in place. Then I removed the track that held the bottom of those panels by removing 5 screws. Once getting the track out of the way, there was 1 or 2 screws on the floor pad itself that I had to remove, and then we were able to lift that floor plate out of the way so we could access that wiring. We didn't want to have to remove any fittings off of the fat sacks. We were able to lift up on the front of the floor plate a little bit and slide it forward to get it around the fitting and then up and out. Once getting the floor plate out on each side, I was able to pull back a little bit of the carpeting that was glued to the stern of the boat so I could access where the wiring was going through the back. I was able to pull a little bit of slack out of the main harness so I could access the pigtails that attach the actuators, and I unclipped those. The hole in the back of the boat where the wires go through to the actuator was not big enough to fit the pigtail ends on the harness through it. So I did end up removing these ends, and you will need a special tool to do so. I did do a quick search on Amazon, and this is a couple options as far as the tool you will need. Most electrical connections will also be labeled with a letter. This one has A, B on it, so you can correctly identify what color wire goes to which letter. It's also a good idea to look for a part number on the pigtail end, and that way you can look up the proper tool to remove the wires that way. There's 2 pigtail ends on this harness. I'm going to start with the one with the small wires going to it because that's the one that needs this special tool. So the first thing you need to do is use a pick or a flathead screwdriver to unclip this part of the pigtail. Then you need that special tool. So right here I'm just making note of what color wire was on what letter. So red was on A and black was on B. So my tool is pretty old and probably been used close to 100 times, so it didn't work as good as a brand new tool would. So I did have to mess with it a little bit more than usual to get these wires to come out, but it did end up getting them off. On the other wire connection, blue wire was on A and the green wire was on B. And all I needed to remove these wires from this pigtail end was a pick, because all you had to do is lift up on a little plastic tab and then pull the wires out the back of the pigtail. Now obviously the other option to this is cutting the wires and butt connecting them back together, However, you're adding another point of failure if you do that, so I do recommend getting the proper tools and disconnecting the wires out of the pigtail ends. So I went through this exact same process on the other side of the boat. While I'm showing you that, I'm going to explain what I figured out as far as these wires go. I actually did some research on the way home from the lake that day and found out a little information about these Parker actuators. And the blue and green wire are your main positive and ground for the motor. When you go to extend your Surfgate, the blue is the positive and the green is the negative. And then when you retract the Surfgate, the green is the positive and the blue is the negative. And if I would have had that information while we were going through this process, I would have used my voltmeter and I could have checked the one that wasn't working and seen if my voltages were switching back and forth when I went into the Surfgate service mode on the boat. What I'm not 100% on is what the actual smaller black and red wires do. I couldn't find anything in the breakdown that I found of this Parker actuator. However, my guess is that it's some type of a positioning sensor or a pressure sensor to tell that motor when to stop. Since it was kind of difficult to see how those pigtails actually came apart, I actually drew it out. So the one with the small black and red wires, the first thing I did is take a pick and there is a slot and a tab. I stuck my pick under that plastic part of the clip and leveraged that slot over this tab to allow that part to come up. Then you need that special round tool, and what that tool does is these pins have two tabs that are bent out to the side. When you put that tool over that pin, it collapses those tabs and allows you to pull the wire out the back of the harness. And it's the same for all four of the wires on those pigtails. The other pigtail that had the green and blue wires that were the bigger wires, all that had was one tab angled back, and all I had to do on that one was put my pick in and collapse that and kind of lift the plastic over that tab, and that allowed me to pull that wiring out of those pigtails. So while I was doing all of that, disconnecting the wiring on the inside of the boat, my buddy was removing the bolts so we could switch the actuators side to side on the outside. He decided to take the 3 bolts off of the bracket on the actual gate. Personally, I would have done the 1 bolt from the actuator to that bracket, but that really didn't matter either way. Then we loosened the nut for the weatherproof connection that the wires ran through. As soon as you take that nut off, that's going to allow that weatherproof fitting to stretch out a little bit, and you should be able to pull the wiring harness out through the back of the boat. When you get to the end, it's better to pull those wires out one by one so you do not pull too hard on those electrical ends. It might be a good idea to have somebody on the inside of the boat as well as the outside of the boat to help guide those wires out of that hole and make sure that the pigtail ends don't get caught on anything while you're getting them through the stern of the boat. We did this on both sides. Then we started to remove the bolts holding the actuator to the stern of the boat. On this one, we definitely did not take the 3 bolts off of the bracket through the stern of the boat. We did remove the 1 bolt from the bracket to the actuator itself. So we took both actuators off and switched them side to side. My daughter actually forgot to hit record during that process. Right here, we're putting the right side actuator on the left-hand side of the boat and running the wires through the stern through that weatherproof fitting. Now, one thing that is super critical if you are pulling the wires out of the pigtail ends is that you bend the retaining clips that hold these connections in place in that plastic pigtail before reassembling them. So I just used a pick to push that retaining clip back up so it catches on that plastic clip that holds it in place. If you don't do this, then you might end up with a weak connection or the wires pulling out of the pigtail with vibration, and you can cause another issue. So once again, since I didn't really get to show you very well on the video itself, here's these pins, and once you use the tool, it's probably going to flatten these pins out so they're more at this angle. So what you want to do is take a pick or a small screwdriver and leverage it between here and pry it up so that that locking tab goes at a greater angle and make sure it will catch on the plastic of that pigtail so it won't back off and vibrate out the back of the connection. Same story with the flat spade style. It's probably going to be bent down a little bit, and you can either push it from the bottom side and push it up through the bottom of that flat connector, or put it between the flat connector and that tab and pry it up and get that at a bigger angle so once again it catches on the plastic part of the pigtail end. Once you get all those locking tabs bent out on the wires, you can go ahead and push those wires back into position in the pigtail ends. Obviously making sure that you have your color to your letter correct on those ends. Right here, I wasn't too confident in how well that one was holding, so I pulled it back out, bent that retaining clip a little farther out, and placed it back in. You do want to tug on each one of these wires after you place them in and make sure they're held firmly in that connector. On the round connectors, there's actually 2 of these locking tabs, and once again I used the pick to bend those out a little bit, then put them in, tugged on the wire a little bit, made sure it was a good connection, and checking the color of wire to the correct letter on the pigtail end. Once I got all the wires in the pigtails, I went ahead and plugged those pigtails back into the harness on the boat. Once getting that side done, I went ahead and jumped over to the other side of the boat and went through this exact same process. This side does have a little better view of me bending those locking tabs out on the ends of the wires. You do want to make sure you don't go 90 degrees on these things. You want to have them at an angle, and if you go too far, there is a chance you're going to break them off. But you can see how flattened out these were before I bent them back out. This is absolutely necessary to do, because once putting all this flooring and stuff back together, you don't want to have a wire come loose because you didn't do that, and then you have to go through this entire process again. So while I'm finishing assembling the pigtails on the other side of the boat, I'm going to share some other information that me and my buddy have learned about this Surfgate system. One is, you probably already know this, but this works in conjunction with the speedometer of the boat. And there is a couple reasons for this. The first one is, if you accidentally forget to engage the cruise control like I have, you don't want that Surfgate being engaged at higher speeds, because that just puts a lot of extra stress on the boat. So the Surfgate should automatically retract right around 14 miles per hour. It also uses that speed to judge when it should extend, because obviously you don't want it coming out when you're at a dead stop, because that's a lot of resistance. So it lets the boat get up to speed a little bit before extending out. And I believe that speed is right around 7 miles per hour. So right here, we've already switched the actuators side to side, and we're just finishing putting the bolts on. This bolt wasn't going, and what I had to do is pull that bolt back out. Then using a crescent wrench, and there was a flat spot on that rod, I rotated that rod just a little bit so that the hole in the bracket would align better with the hole in the rod. Now I wouldn't get crazy with turning that, but just pitching it side to side a little bit to help you align that bolt is not going to be a big deal. I did use a ratchet with a socket just to help thread it through those holes as well, because it was a very tight fit. When tightening down this bolt and the one on the stern of the boat to the other bracket, you don't want to put those super tight, and that is the reason they should have nylon or lock nuts on them, because that is the pivot point for this actuator. So if you tighten them down too tight, you might cinch that bracket down on the rod and make it harder for that actuator to work. So once you feel that bolt tightening down on that bracket, you do want to stop, and as long as there's a little bit of that bolt sticking out past the nut, it should not back off, and that is the purpose of those nylon nuts. So once we got everything snug down on both sides, we went ahead and calibrated the Surfgate one more time to make sure that the system knew exactly where those Surfgates were closed at. After calibrating, we went back into the menu and activated the service Surfgate so we could see if our problem had switched from the right side to the left side. The problem did remain on the right side, not opening, which we were kind of bummed out at first, but then we realized at least it's not the $1,300 actuator that is the problem. Hopefully it is something much cheaper. So at this point, we basically decided to switch the wiring if it would reach from side to side on the surf gates. The harness for the surf gates actually came in on the left side underneath the engine. I was able to pull a little bit more slack out of that harness from the bottom of the boat. Then I had to loosen the right side weatherproof fitting where the wires go through and pull a little bit of slack from the outside of the boat to give me more wiring on the inside. If it ends up being that you need some extra wiring as well to make that harness reach on the inside of the boat, and you have to do this, I recommend leaving that nut loose, taking the amount of wiring you need to the inside of the boat, go into the service mode of the Surfgate, and extend and retract that Surfgate while watching to make sure that it's not pulling tension on that wiring harness before putting the nut back on that weatherproof fitting and tightening it down. That way you do still have a little bit of give in that harness, compared to if you tighten that nut down and then try it, it might stretch the wiring. In all actuality, that harness really doesn't move much from extend to retract, so it shouldn't really be a problem, but this is just a precaution. Now, I did have to cut some zip ties on this wiring harness to get this stuff to reach. And if you do decide to do this, make sure you electrical tape or zip tie those wires back up away from your steering mechanism or anything else it might rub or get caught on, because you don't want to create another issue. Once we hooked the left side boat harness to the right side actuator and the right side boat harness to the left side actuator, the left side stayed closed and the right side worked as it should. So that told me that we either have a wiring issue, but I don't think that is the problem because both motors were coming on. These systems do have a relay box that is basically the module to control them. And I believe one of the relays is stuck and basically telling it to close all the time instead of switching to extend. We did go ahead and calibrate it one more time just to be on the safe side, even though we probably didn't have to. And then this is the right side working with the service option in the menu. So since none of us are goofy-footed that we're going to the lake that day, that's all we needed was that right side gate to open. So we went ahead and headed to the lake and didn't have an issue with that surf gate on that side at all that day. Right here, we're just putting both of the floor plates back in and the engine side panels. When installing the floor plates, those go into plastic or fiberglass in the boat. So I like to use my drill when putting those in, and that way I can set the torque setting so I don't over tighten them and possibly strip out that fiberglass or plastic that they're going into. So in my honest opinion, I think it is going to be the relay module that took a crap on this thing. However, I don't know if we're going to worry about it because once again, none of us are goofy-footed, so this will get us through the summer. I don't really see the point in messing with it if it's working good enough for us for the next couple months while it's 115 degrees in Phoenix, Arizona. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. Hope you have a good one. Later.